Hello, and welcome to California Death Row, where we're talking about it. This is our YouTube channel, and we post Mondays, Wednesdays, and Saturdays. We talk about different cases of individuals that are currently on death row, those that have died on death row, those that were executed, and then those that were exonerated from death row. This is just a brief overview, kind of what we're all about, and then where does California get the death penalty and it being in our penal code. So there are currently 727 condemned inmates on California's death row. This is current as of May 6, 2020, and you can find the list on the California's Corrections and Rehabilitation website. They have the list of all of them, so if you're interested on seeing who's there, you can see them. So, California Penal Code section 190.3 is where you'll find the law about capital punishment. It was approved by California voters in 1978. It was repealed, and then it was added November 7th, 1978. So California voters voted on it. We'll talk about that proposition in a second. And then it became part of California Penal Code. And then Penal Code section 190.2 is where you'll find the list of special circumstances a defendant can be charged with along with first-degree murder. And that's what really is how the capital punishment plays out. So for a capital punishment case to happen, it happens in two phases. First, you have the guilt phase. This is where a death-qualified jury will listen to evidence during the guilt phase, deliberate, and then deliver a verdict of guilty or not guilty on first-degree murder. Attached to that charge is a special circumstance found in section 190.2. And the jury will then, if they find the defendant guilty of first-degree murder, they'll then look at the special circumstance and find it true or not true. So if they say they found the defendant guilty of murder and the special circumstance was robbery, meaning that they had the intention and they were committing this robbery, and then the victim dies, murder, and they find that true, that happened, then the jury will enter in the second phase, which is the penalty phase. And this is where they'll hear aggregating and mitigating evidence. And if the defendant had previous convictions and they weren't allowed to be the jury wasn't allowed to hear them at the guilt phase because it could be, what is the word? It could be prejudice towards the defendant. They would actually hear it at the penalty phase because that would go with the aggravating evidence, but they have a history of child abuse, drug abuse, that could be used as a mitigating circumstance that they might not have been in the right mind when this happened. And so the jury will then go and deliberate, and this is where they decide death or life without the possibility of parole. So Proposition 7 was on the November 1978 ballot. The California voters approved this measure, and then it was the constitutionality of the proposition was questioned, but then it was affirmed. And so now this is what the death penalty statute under which California operates even today. In November 2012, Proposition 34 was on the ballot, and this was the death penalty initiative statute. It was a ballot measure to repeal the death penalty and make the maximum punishment life without the possibility of parole for murder. If the state's voters approved it, the 728 condemned inmates that were on death row at the time would have their sentences converted to life without parole. 52% of California voters voted against it. So even through, obviously today we still have the death penalty, so this repeal did not work. And then on the November 2016 ballot, there were two competing propositions. There was Proposition 62, which I'm about to talk about, and then Proposition 66. So Proposition 62 was the repeal of the death penalty initiative. If it passed, condemned inmates that were on death row at the time would have their sentences converted to life without parole. That measure also had a requirement that condemned inmates work and would have increases of portions of their wages for victim restitution from 20% to 60%. So if a worker is working and they make $1, instead of only having 20% of that dollar go to the victim, it now means 60% of that dollar goes to victim restitution. 53.1% of California voters voted against Proposition 62. And then Proposition 66 was the Death Penalty Reform and Savings Act that was also on that ballot. And what this was that it keeps the death penalty for California, but it had all these new things that were added to it. So what it added was Section 6304.1 to the Penal Code, which expressly exempts standards, procedures, or regulations initiated by the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation pursuant to Penal Code 3604 from the Administrative Procedures Act. The measure allowed physicians to attend the execution, to pronounce death, and to provide to the CDCR for the purpose of developing an execution protocol to minimize the risk of pain to the inmate. It also allows identified individuals or entities to dispense drugs and supplies to the CDCR secretary or designee without prescription for carrying out the provisions of the chapter, and prevents increasing boards from imposing disciplinary action against any licensed healthcare professional or any action authorized by Penal Code Section 6304. Proposition 66 also allows prison officials to transfer condemned inmates to any state prison that provides the necessary level of security, requires that condemned inmates work as prescribed by the rules and regulations of CDCR, and increases the restitution deduction for condemned inmates to 70% or the balance owing, whichever is less, from condemned inmates' wages and trust account deposits, regardless of the source of income. So if there's a condemned inmate who has this trust money that's coming in, portions of that would go to the victim restitution instead of just whatever is being worked on. This is also a 10% increase than what was proposed in Proposition 62. This was passed by 51.1% of California voters, obviously voted to approve it. However, one of the plaintiffs, Ron Briggs and John Van de Kamp, they filed a lawsuit against the California Supreme Court challenging the constitutionality of Proposition 66. The California Supreme Court stayed the implementation in December of 2016, heard oral arguments on June 6, 2017, and then in a 5-2 ruling on August 24, 2017, they upheld Proposition 66, and it became effective October 25, 2017. Now, if you go to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation website, you can see how Proposition 66 is currently in a little pilot and only having a certain number of condemned inmates pretty much go in this pilot and see how it works for them. And it also lets you know what kind of level of security that these inmates can go to. Obviously, they're not going to go to a minimum security prison, because then you can just walk out on the grounds if you want to. So they're still in max, they still have security, they still have electric fences, so it's still high level security, but they are allowed to work, and 70% of their earnings goes to victim restitution. So if you want to check that more out, you definitely can. Today, there is an executive order that is still in place by Governor Gavin Newsom that has halted the death penalty in California. We still have the death penalty because California voters need to vote whether they want to keep it or repeal it. Obviously, the last 2 times it's been on the ballot, it has been struck down, but he has issued this executive order in a form of reprieve for all the people that are sentenced to death. So those 727 inmates have a reprieve where they cannot go on schedule to be executed. And then what he's questioning, in a way, is the lethal injection protocol, and he wants to immediately close the execution chamber of San Quentin State Prison. But in order to do that, California voters need to vote on it. So right now, we're halted, even though our last execution was in 2006. It's still halted by this executive order. If Gavin Newsom is elected out of office and there's a new governor, the new governor can keep this executive order, or they can get rid of it and California can go back to executing. But the reason why we're on hold is because of that lethal injection protocol. So that has been in question. So for right now, the executions in California are still kind of put on hold. So kind of going to those executions, there are 6 exonerees. However, one of them was found guilty of burglary and other charges. So he was exonerated from the death sentence. However, he was found guilty of these lesser charges, but due to his time, he was out and he was able to go. There have been 15 executions. However, 2 of them were actually out of state. And if you want to go to the California Department of Corrections and Rehabilitation website, the CDCR, which you totally can, you can see the inmates that were executed, and they give you the list. The 2 that were executed out of California, one was executed in Missouri and the other in Virginia. And so you can see what they were charged with, how long they were on death row, what age they were when they were executed. So how does that happen? You get a death sentence in California, you get a death sentence in another state. One of the states kind of picks and chooses who gets who, and then you're kind of serving on their death row. So for Ted Bundy, he killed out in different states, and then in order for him to get killed in Florida, that's where he got sentenced to death. But there's a whole story on that. So it kind of depends on that story, on that circumstance, where if you have multiple death sentence, usually the state that does the most executions kind of takes over. So if you have a death sentence in California and a death sentence in Texas, you're most likely going to go to Texas because they are still executing people, unlike California. So that's a little bit about us. Kind of go off a little bit, but you can like us, subscribe us, follow us. We're on Spotify. You can follow our podcast there if you just want to listen, if you're on a drive, or even here you can see our little PowerPoints. Thank you, and hopefully we'll see you later.